President Biden ran on a promise to improve Americans' lives and the economy, even branding his latest plan as Bidenomics. But a closer look reveals working people are being left behind. Journalists for The Lever examined the so-called Bidenomics through a humanitarian lens and found that while the country's economy appears to have fully recovered by some metrics, people have not.
Here to discuss this ongoing crisis for the working class is writer for The Lever News and author of the piece Bidenomics Isn't Working for Working People, Stephen Semler. Thank you for joining us, Stephen.
My pleasure.
Well, so what is the thesis of your latest reporting?
Thesis is that, countrywide economic indicators don't necessarily reflect the economic conditions of the people living in it. Essentially, what's happening is that Democrats are pointing to broad indicators like gross domestic product, unemployment, and saying, look, everything's fine. When if you look a bit closer and you look at better measures we have of people's livelihoods, which is what I did, I looked at financial insecurity and food insecurity, which is basically just having enough to eat within the last 7 days or trouble paying the bills. You find that it's not necessarily reflected, the economic recovery is in everyday life. So I think this will present major problems for Democrats going into the 2024 elections.
I mean, major problems indeed. You cite a number of recent polls, one that shows that only 34% of Americans approve of Biden's economic leadership compared to his 41% overall approval rating. Just 20% of voters think the economy is good or excellent, compared to 78% who say it is only fair or poor. And a third poll that you cover that found that nearly 70% of Americans think the economy is worse now than in 2020 when the pandemic started in the United States. So the Biden administration's approach to this seems to be to just keep saying, well, look at all of these other metrics. The economy is doing well. And I'm sure by those metrics, technically that is true. Why is it that you think that isn't working this time when historically I think a lot of different kinds of politicians have often pointed to stock market and other broad economic metrics to convince working people that they should be broadly satisfied with their lot in life? Do you think that something has shifted where there is now this perceived gap between what the typical metrics are and what people are willing to say is actually working for them?
I think there has been a bit of a shift because, what the pandemic, led to, I think, was just a reevaluation of economic policy and public policy, the relationship between the two. So, I mean, in the past, Democrats sort of kind of messed up this stimulus recovery in 2009, and there wasn't really the widespread recovery from it that people expected. And there was an economic downturn that they didn't acknowledge in 2015, 2016, even though, the broad economic indicators look good and they got beat in the 2016 election. So I think people are just not shy anymore about speaking up about it. But, at the same time, liberal pundits and Democratic politicians are just, it seems like their strategy is to shout over this. Liberal pundits often dismiss people who say the economy isn't good to, oh, they're just ignorant or they're ruthlessly partisan. Well, that's not the case. I mean, you can point to the data in this article and say, yeah, the people have a point. Things aren't going well.
What specific data are we talking about? We're talking about, inflation being persistently high, even though it did come down a little bit. Take-home pay. What do you think people is being missed by Biden and Biden surrogates when they say, oh no, the picture's getting a lot rosier every day?
Just the indicators, just the measures we have about the quality of everyday life. Is life getting more livable compared to 2020, which was extremely bad? And the numbers for 2022 and 2023 have been worse than 2020. So the numbers I looked at chiefly are the Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, which is just this survey that was developed early on in the pandemic, early in 2020, to essentially provide data in real time about people's livelihoods. Across a whole suite of issues. I just picked the two of their longest running ones, which were how difficult is it for you to pay for groceries? How difficult is it for you to pay for usual bills? And those are measures you see all the time. Like, I come from the humanitarian sector. That's measures that are pretty commonplace in the developing world, but in the developed world in the global north, apparently we're too good to look at those things. So the role of the Census Bureau survey, which is excellent. I hope it sticks around. It's really the best form of human security measures we've got, and it was specifically designed to provide more insight than these broad economic indicators suggest, like GDP, unemployment, inflation, which all, I'm happy to see those metrics have recovered, and they do have some bearing on everyday life. But if we have better data available to essentially find out how people are actually doing, and if these numbers are reflected in day-to-day life, then why aren't we using them? So
Yeah.
that was sort of my interest.
I mean, something that, I talk a lot about on this show is how the country doing well and companies doing well and profiting more doesn't increasingly trickle down to the people who are actually creating that profit through their labor. And so this is, I think, a really important illustration of how, yes, you can have recovery on a macro basis, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's trickling down to the lived experience of people who are actually doing the labor and all of these jobs around the country. One really important point I think that you make in this article is that there were real gains made in terms of making conditions better for working people in the wake of the pandemic, but that the policies that were implemented to save lives at that time during those emergency conditions were allowed to lapse. And that's part of the bait and switch that I think the Biden administration is doing right now, which is to say, look at all that we accomplished, look how we halved child poverty, look at how we did all of these things, but none of that lasted. So you write that in August of 2021, there were 19 million fewer people in financial distress than when Biden entered office. The food insecure population had dropped by more than 6 million. But those achievements didn't last. That same month, the eviction ban expired. The following month, extended unemployment coverage with additional benefits, and the foreclosure ban ended as well. Then the enhanced child tax credits, which reduced food insecurity by 3%, weren't renewed for 2020. And so what you have is actually an illustration that the government can do things like dramatically lower the poverty rates, including halving child poverty, but policy decisions are being made not to continue those programs. And are people recognizing, although the government can do something, the government can help, it is now choosing not to? Is that part of what we're seeing with this frustration with these macro numbers in the polls that show that the people just aren't buying the recovery?
Yeah, I mean, politicians appearing out of touch. I mean, can you name a more annoying quality of politicians have of telling people that everything's fine when it isn't? Especially when, the measures I was looking at are people being short on cash and people being hungry. So, an annoying politician accompanied with those indicators won't bode well at all. And I will say this, I saw some chatter around my article on Twitter or whatever it's called now, about how these, of course, they were going to expire. It was Republicans who did this. It's like, yeah, Republicans were encouraging them to be these programs to be terminated. But at the same time, the last major spending bill or the last major bill passed by the Democratic trifecta in late December 2020 essentially killed off extended benefits for SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, leaving 32 million people with fewer benefits than they had the year before. Or had before, and also kicked off the process of this Medicaid purge, where during the pandemic, people weren't allowed to be kicked off the program. And now it's just this sort of bureaucratic hell that's being taken place. It's just an outright disaster. Over 4 million have been kicked off already, and upwards of 20 million, I've read 24 million could be kicked off, not necessarily because people don't belong in the program. It's just bureaucratic errors and confusing paperwork that'll be a result. So Democrats actually played a role in killing off this pandemic superstructure that was for welfare that was going on during the pandemic. It wasn't just a matter of letting it expire, although that was definitely part of it.
Well, a new CNN report highlights inflation is gutting family budgets, with the typical household shelling out about $709 more than just 2 years ago to cover inflated costs. Podcaster Joe Rogan hit Biden's handling of the economy, even saying how people fared better under his predecessor, Donald Trump. Let's watch.
The country was in a great economic situation, and it looked like his policies were actually effective, and that it looked like the unemployment was down, all business was building, regulations were being relaxed, more things were getting done. When you look at it from a policy perspective, if you just look at it on paper, what he did was effective.
A lot of people who are going to say this criticism of Biden means that we need to change courses and go back to the Trump era. Do you expect that some of these kinds of policies that we're talking about that the Biden administration let lapse will have any backing behind them under a Republican administration?
I don't think so. I don't think the Republican answer to those sorts of questions that I bring up in the article are any sort of feasible solutions or solutions at all. But the Republicans are talking about these everyday conditions, not necessarily always truthfully, but they're at least speaking to a reality that exists when so far Democrats are just refusing to acknowledge that such a reality exists at all. And these aren't small numbers. I mean, in terms of financial insecurity, we're looking at numbers that are close to 90 million, and that's just adults. For food insecurity, we're approaching 30 million. This is a ton of people that are hungry and financially distressed or just facing difficult times. And this is acute insecurity here. This is like, did you have trouble in the past week? A lot of these measures are talking in the last month or year. This is a really bad sign if these numbers are. So I think it will come back to bite Democrats. I don't think Republicans have an answer, but they're at least talking about people's hardships, and that goes some distance.
Stephen Semler, thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.